So today we're going to take a look at Geography of Genius by Eric Weiner, or however his name's pronounced. I didn't like this book very much. The general premise I actually found pretty interesting. What he does is he takes a look at various places throughout history that have produced geniuses or golden ages, and he tries to pinpoint what it is about that area that was particularly effective at creating genius. So he goes through Athens, Edinburgh, Vienna twice, once with Mozart and Beethoven, and I think the second time with Freud. Jingzhou, I think, is the Chinese city that he goes through. It might be Hangzhou. I can't recall. And it's a bit interesting, but what it kind of like works out to being, as promising as the premise was, is it's like one part biography because he kind of centers down on individuals who came from these cities. One part travel blog because the guy talks about his own experience a lot in like a narrative format. One part he's actually trying to like put forth like this somewhat cohesive argument. I think he fails to make it cohesive, and overall I don't think the book does any of those parts well. It's so like the travel blog part is like somewhat entertaining, and like his writing style is a little funny, and you get that, okay. But a lot of times in terms of like putting forth a sort of narrative where he's actually trying to be like, okay, what is it about areas in their golden ages that create genius? So sometimes he's citing studies and it seems to be empirically minded, and other times he's just saying stuff out of the blue seemingly with no support, and he's just saying this is the way it is because it fits the narrative well of the one anecdotal person he's talking about. So it's not rigorous at all in the way it is trying to suss out what causes genius, in my estimation. And so you have this book where the guy's like talking about his travels, and to the extent you want to learn about genius, you don't really care about his travel blog experience, right? And then to the extent that you're trying to figure out genius, you also don't care about the biographical stuff too much, as far as like really going into the people's lives for like a bit of a snippet. And so it just seems like this very superficial tour through areas where there were smart people while not doing anything particularly well, not talking about what causes genius particularly well, certainly not biographically covering any individual well because he has to cover so many things, and then just talking about his own like ramping through these different areas and talking to people. And he writes a lot about his discussions he has with people, like interviews. So he has like one interview with someone who's like, I don't know, like in Greece he had like an interview with a tour guide and like a academic like philosopher, and this props up most of the chapter for him. And it's just people giving their slapsticky opinions that sound good but aren't vetted with any sort of evidence, and then he like puts it together and like weaving a sort of narrative. To some extent it's entertaining because like his writing's okay. It's not like terrible to read. I'm not knocking the writing, I'm knocking the organizational ability and like the research. Briefly I'll just go through the cities that he covers, just because I feel like I'm complaining and not summarizing very well. He goes through Silicon Valley, that's the last one. The first one's Athens, and the principle is genius is simple. Then genius is nothing new from Hangzhou. Genius is expensive from Florence. Genius is practical from Edinburgh. Genius is chaotic from Calcutta. Genius is unintentional from Vienna, the first Vienna chapter. Genius is contagious, Vienna on the couch, talking about Freud. And genius is weak, Silicon Valley. And he talks about how weak relationships are, and having a disparate network is what makes Silicon Valley unique, because you can get like kind of anything done quickly because there's so many like weak relationships. Anyways, the book is mildly interesting. I won't belabor it too much. I'll get into the ratings. So for utility, I give it a 2.5. I don't think it puts forth a cohesive model, even though he does like, obviously the chapters are organized by saying that this is the one central thing, but I don't think he, like, the point he is trying to make, he is clearly trying to make one point for each chapter, and in that sense it's cohesive, but I don't think he does a good job making any of the points because he relies too much on anecdotal evidence, not on empirical evidence, and just like, and then he's like talking about what he's doing when he's like drinking coffee. So for utility, if you wanted to try and figure out what you can do to make yourself more like intelligent, or like this sort of thing, or to how to pick which environment you should move to, or like how you should shape your environment in terms of how to become smarter, this is not the book. This book's going to provide no use in that respect. There are some interesting ideas that I think, to some extent, in some spots he leans on empirical evidence, and I think the empirical evidence he does lean on is useful, but there's just better ways to get it. And so I have to score utility low, not because like this book is completely useless, but because for whatever your intention is in getting this book, you're better off getting something else. Like this, just I can't think of a single. So for novelty, I gave it a 2, much for the same reason. You know, there are some ideas that you maybe not encounter somewhere else, but you can certainly go without reading this book, which is one of the criteria. And secondly, in terms of difficulty encountering these ideas, I don't think any of these ideas are tremendously difficult to encounter. I've read books that have, you know, a lot more in the way of empirical evidence to argue similar points, and I thought were much more robust. Okay. For entertainment, I gave it a 5.5. He has his moments. It's written in a way that's like somewhat engaging. It was enough to sucker me into like the first half of the book, kind of enjoying it a little bit, I guess, or like the first third. At least like just generally speaking, if I finish the first chapter of a book, I'm gonna finish the book. And so it was entertaining enough to get me to finish the first chapter, although I'm a sucker for Athens and Greece, so like maybe this is the topic that suckered me in. But after that, it kind of felt like pulling teeth, mainly because I thought the book was bad, more so than his like writing just being terrible. His writing's okay. So for style, I gave it a 6. This guy has published other books. His writing seems okay. I didn't want to give him a super low score on the writing. Maybe he deserves a little bit lower than a 6. I don't know. I felt that I bumped up the score quite a bit just because of I was frustrated with the lack of empirical grounding of the book, which made me not enjoy the book. And I don't think that I'm trying not to hold that against him when it comes to judging his writing style, because it's a separate thing. Like, right, that's going to be in utility and novelty and interest to some extent. For readability, I gave it a 6. It's really easy to read. The only reason I didn't score it higher is because I don't think he conveys ideas well, and that's like kind of a part of readability. Like, if you have a book that's conveying an extremely difficult idea, and it does it really well, then you should score higher in readability. I think he's conveying ideas that are not hard to convey, and he conveys them pretty well, and the book's easy to read. But like, the challenge put forth for him was not particularly hard. So I gave it a 6. For interest, I gave it a 4. I do think the premise is incredibly interesting, and I think the cities and individuals he talks about are incredibly interesting. I think the way he executes it, where he is injecting in his own personal travel blog, as well as interviews with people who just give kind of like anecdotal quips, I don't think that's interesting, and that's why it scores low. So there's plenty of reasons why this part should score high, and plenty of reason why it should score low, and so I settled on a 4 for interest. For an overall score of the quite low 4.33, which not many books get below a 5. This is one of them. As far as recommendations go, would not recommend this book to... I have to think and concentrate to find a scenario in which I would recommend this book. I suppose if you really like travel blogs, maybe this would be a good book for you. I don't like travel blogs, so maybe that was just like a mismatch. Generally speaking, I would not recommend this book. I kind of regret. I like finishing books, like collecting scalps, and I kind of regret. Once I was halfway through and I decided I didn't like the book, I regret not just putting it down and not finishing it. I wish I just didn't finish it. So generally speaking, I would not recommend this book. But okay, I read it. Somewhat interesting. Doesn't feel like zero value. It just feels like I would have gotten more value reading something else, or perhaps anything else. As far as discussion question goes, it's been a while since I've read a book that I didn't like. I think there's been like 3 or 4 books that I've rated below a 5. One of them was just way worse than this book. I really made a mistake finishing that book. But has anyone for discussion, has anyone read any books that they particularly didn't like recently in the realm of nonfiction? Or just because I'm generally more interested in nonfiction? Although I suppose fiction. Has anyone read any books they didn't like? So that's part 1 discussion, and then part 2 discussion. Just curious, does anyone have any ideas on what makes an area or culture conducive to genius? Because this is the topic of the book, and I actually think it's a tremendously interesting topic. I just think it's poorly executed by the part of our dear friend Eric. And so, yeah, if you like this, feel free to give it a like. If you want to see more, subscribe, YouTube stuff, comment, juice the algo, and have a good day.